Good evening. My name is Claire Finn. I'm sure you know that by now. And first, a little housekeeping. Well, we have already waited for everyone to get in from the digital waiting room, and I doubt that there might be a few more people joining us. I'm sure you all know by now that if your internet link drops out, just go back round in a circle and click on the link again. This will be the first talk run on the Icon office's event folio system, and we would welcome your feedback on the experience. Please put it in the chat. However, to ask questions about the talk, which you can do at any time during this evening's talk, please ask them through the Q&A facility, which is at the bottom of your screen. And we'll answer them all at the end. This evening, our speaker is Christine Sitwell. Christine received her Masters of Science degree from the Winterthur University of Delaware Programme in Art Conservation, followed by a National Museums Fellowship for an internship in the Painters Conservation Department at the Tate Gallery, London. She joined the National Trust in 1990, advising on the conservation of paintings and historic interiors until her retirement in 2020. She's an accredited member of Icon and a fellow of IIC, and also chairwoman of the Icon Historic Interiors Group. Tina, over to you, a little painter who is in the house cleaning pictures.
Thank you, Claire. And I'd like to thank everyone who's joined the webinar this evening, particularly as it's a glorious evening, at least down here in Wiltshire it is. And I feel we should all be outside having a glass of wine or something else, but thank you for actually listening to me. In February 1996, Sarah Staniforth and I organized a conference at the National Gallery in London to coincide with the 100th anniversary of the National Trust, which had been formed in 1895. This conference, Studies in the History of Painting Restoration, included my paper on the approach to restoration in English country houses. The impetus for my paper for this conference was the account book of Henry Bolton, a 19th century restorer from Plymouth, which had been brought to my attention by a curatorial colleague, Jeremy Pearson. And I've always wanted to hope this was Henry, because I found this photograph in the account book. And I know he had a grandson that he took care of. So I'm hoping this is Henry playing cricket on the Devon coast. And since that time, my interest has continued and has really been helped by Jacob Simon's extraordinary database on British picture restorers, which is available online through the National Portrait Gallery. And other conservators such as Morwenna Blewett have also contributed to this field. I was slightly worried when I was asked to give this presentation, as COVID has presented a bit of a stumbling block to access to National Trust archives for the past 16 months, and it's been very limited, as has access to other institutions such as the Hamilton Car, which houses the archives for Horace Buttery and John Brealey. However, it has given me an opportunity to consider questions such as the domestic arrangements in houses for the care of paintings, the involvement of owners in organizing restoration treatments. Did they coincide with a change of ownership, remodeling of the house, visit by royalty, and which paintings were to be restored and who selected the restorers? Also, the influence or the possible influence of 19th century books on restoration, the involvement of any advisors or dealers or other country house owners helping other people to select the correct restorer. And then finally, how did the Trust organize the care of paintings prior to the establishment of our conservation section? In Jenny Rose's paper, An Investigation into the Domestic Care of Paintings in English Country Houses in the 18th and 19th centuries, which she also presented at this conference, she gives us a glimpse of the extent of the day-to-day care of pictures and frames and who held that responsibility for their care. Housekeeping procedures were generally passed down by word of mouth through the household hierarchy, but in some instances, notebooks compiled by the mistress of the house have survived. At Felbrigg, Catherine Wyndham, the mistress of the Felbrigg estate in the late 17th and early 18th century, recorded not only cooking recipes, but also household management information, including the care of paintings. And although there are few references to paintings, she does recommend the cleaning of paintings in the following way: to sift some wood ash very fine, mix with fair water, and wash your picture well over with it. She also suggests to beat up the whites of eggs to a froth and wash them over to give it a gloss. Although it is difficult to assess the extent of care undertaken by household staff, one can assume that some dusting was undertaken by housemaids, as recommended by Anne Cobbett in her book, The English Housekeeper, which you see on the right-hand side. She suggests dust pictures with an old silk handkerchief, duster, soft painter's brush, or a pair of bellows. It's interesting to note that there was also an awareness of preventive measures. It was fairly common practice in the country houses to cover paintings during the periods of absence of the family. Thus, up to 6 months, pictures might be covered over with linen sheets. And it must be assumed that this was due to concern over potential damage to light levels. There's an instruction in Susanna Watman's housekeeping book of 1776, which she says, "In the White Room, the sun must be kept out on all account of the various handsome pieces of furniture and pictures." It's also interesting to note is that there's mention of the way of strengthening a decayed canvas. And she says, to preserve sound canvas from decaying, let the back of every picture receive 2 or 3 coats of white lead or whatever other cheap pigment is most recommended for tenacity and strength. And here on the right-hand side, you see the reverse of a painting from Laycock, where a red lead coating has been added. And interestingly, it's been, they've left the inscription still visible so you can see it. If the mistress of the house did not play an active role in household management, it was the housekeeper who assumed that responsibility. The best known early housekeeper in the National Trust was Mrs. Garnett of Kettleston in the late 18th century. Perhaps better known for her tours of the house, which included providing information about paintings. I would tend to think that her pride in the collection may have involved her in overseeing their care as well, although I haven't found any evidence to that effect. In addition to the domestic staff at Kettleston, carpenters and joiners employed on the estate often undertook various activities on paintings. So we find in the account books records of making and altering stretcher frames, the fitting up of old linings behind paintings, washing of frames, and varnishing of pictures. While household account, notebooks, and published books on household management provided the mistress of the house or the housekeeper with guidance on the care of the house's contents, artist manuals often included sections which were intended for the owners of paintings, as well as professional restorers. By the 19th century, the specialist trade of the restorer was well established, and authors such as Manfred Holyoake, who you see on the left, Henry Merritt on the right, and Henry Mogford wrote books on the conservation or restoration of pictures in the 19th century. It's difficult to know if owners of country houses were familiar with these publications. And in my recent correspondence with Tim Pye, who is the current libraries advisor for the National Trust, he mentioned that his initial search of books in National Trust properties failed to reveal the presence of these books. However, the authors certainly had them in mind as they described the perils facing paintings inflicted by neglect, the environment, or overzealous treatment. Holyoake was aware of the detrimental effects of the poor environment and recommended that paintings not be hung over fireplaces, in direct sunlight, or on damp walls. And Henry Mogford advised covering the entire back, including the frame, with tinfoil glued down at the edges, and for large paintings to be covered with oilskin stained and strained and fastened at the edges. One of the earliest references for restoration undertaken in the National Trust is at Saltrum in Devon. And this is a good starting point, as there's a relatively long and well-documented history of picture restorers working at Saltrum from 1795 until the mid-1950s. And the names of these restorers will lead us to other properties and people who were advising country house owners or the National Trust. In a letter from Teresa Parker, seen here on the right-hand side with her brother, John Parker, who was Lord Morley, she writes to him on October 8th, 1795, and she says, "The breakfast room is entirely filled up and looks quite beautiful. All the portraits are taken away and a great number of very good pictures put up instead of them. They were at Sackville Street, and some are taken from different parts of the house. They've all been cleaned and varnished." Several days later, in another letter to her brother, she states that in the house are Lord and Lady Fortescue, Lord and Lady Worcester, and a little painter who is in the house cleaning pictures. This little painter was Timothy Colopy, an Irish artist who resided in London after having studied painting in Rome and became a picture cleaner. In November that year, he writes from Saltrum to Lord Morley, who's in London, and he says, "I was honored with your favor of the 26th instant. Relative to the pictures on the staircase, they are finished and are hung. Some of these were damaged more than I could perceive when I was honored with your company in viewing them. The pictures in the saloon are finished except for 2 pictures by Angelica Kaufmann. This is a tedious job on account of the number of small cracks to be filled. The pictures in the red velvet room, which is the room on the right-hand side, were taken down and brought up to my room yesterday. There remains the pictures in the blue room numbering 26, the billiard room numbering 23, in the dining room numbers of 10, and for cleaning and varnishing. So I expect to be able to finish before the holidays." I can only speculate as to why Lord Morley had commissioned Colopy to restore 59 paintings. Lord Morley had left the house between 1788 and 1793, returning to take charge of it in 1793 when he completed his grand tour. It appears that he was making a significant change to the hanging of paintings, as we see that the Kaufmanns, which had been in the saloon, were then moved over to the staircase. And so he may have decided to undertake restoration at the same time, and particularly the treatment of the paintings of the Angelica Kaufmanns, because they were already deteriorating, as was so evident in Colopy's letter. The next intervention began in 1840 under the auspices of his son, the second Earl of Morley. And unlike his father, he spent more time at Saltrum, particularly trying to clear the debts he inherited from his father. It's interesting, therefore, that he had begun a large restoration project. Of the 171 paintings listed in the 1844 catalog, 113 were restored between 1840 and 1845. And the restorer was Henry Bolton, who was on the right-hand side. And he resided in Plymouth, but also took lodgings in London. So he divided his time between the Southwest and also London and other areas as well. Henry's account book, as well as the invoices and letters housed at the Devon Record Office, provide a unique insight into his restoration practices and his materials. His invoices frequently refer to cleaning. And I'm sorry this is so small, but basically, it says materials for cleaning and restoring the following pictures. And he lists the pictures on the left-hand side and the materials that he was going to charge Lord Morley for the restoration. So it's difficult to determine from what he says whether he's referring to surface cleaning, the removal of dirt and other accretions, or is he actually discussing the removal of the varnish. But one indication for surface cleaning would be the number of paintings which are listed as being treated on a daily basis. In some instances, he does give a fuller description, which clearly indicates the removal of varnish. And this can be seen on this painting by Angelica Kaufmann, which is Vortigern, the king of Britain, enamored of Rowena at the banquet of Hengist. He says, 8 days, taking down, cleaning and repairing, stopping cracks throughout the painting and varnishing. And it's interesting to note that he's restoring the same Kaufmann paintings which had been restored by Colopy in 1795. He's also paid for frosting the skylight on the main staircase, which may be seen as a preventive measure to reduce the amount of light on the staircase, particularly as the Kaufmanns, I think there are 7 which hang on the staircase. Now in 1853, he is one of a number of restorers invited to give evidence to the Select Committee on the National Gallery on the cleaning of 9 paintings. And as part of that evidence, he states that his method for acquiring knowledge of picture restoration has been through experiments on pictures and study. I did find in his notebook an invoice or receipt for the purchase of a book called Chemistry for Cleaning Pictures by William Buchanan, but I haven't been able to find a copy of that book. He also states that he is willing to openly discuss his restoration processes with owners, but not with other restorers. And this certainly came out with the other restorers who were giving evidence that it was a very secretive practice at that time. And one of the instances in which he is openly discussing his restoration is when he's working at Broadlands, because he writes to his son, Edward. He says, I see Lord Palmerston for about a quarter of an hour each morning as he directs me himself what to do, not his lady as before, my workroom being next to his study. And I find it interesting that he says, not my lady, because it's often in country houses that the care of the collection and overseeing things that were to happen was actually in the hands of the mistress of the house, because often the owner of the husband might be off doing other things, he might be in Parliament, whatever. So obviously she at one point had been instructing Henry on what to do. Henry returns again to Saltrum in 1854 to clean smoke from the 9 paintings on the staircase. And this is just another instance showing the type of information that was gleaned from the archives I found, where he refers to just cleaning and varnishing, and then he refers to restoring. So it's difficult to sometimes know the extent of what he's actually doing. In 1861, the second Earl of Morley, facing a financial crisis, lets the house to his son, the third Earl of Morley, and he spends almost 23 years clearing debts that he inherited from his father. And again, it's pure speculation, but he may have decided that after such a long absence, turning his attention to the care of his collection was important, particularly if he was announcing his return to friends within his social circle within the Southwest. Henry Bolton dies in 1871. And the restorer taking his place was Horace Buttery. And Horace Buttery's dates are 1846 to 1900. And he was the son of Charles Buttery, who was also a restorer. Now, the name of Buttery has a long association with picture restoration in a rather complicated line of descent. Horace's assistants, so Charles Buttery was the father. Then you have Horace Buttery. He's the one who's working at Saltrum. And his assistant was Ernst Hooker. And when Horace dies, Hooker takes the name of Buttery for some reason. And then it's his son, Horace Ernst Buttery, who was between 1902 and 1962, who becomes one of the most respected private restorers of the 20th century and would play an important role in the recent restoration of many paintings in many National Trust properties. Between 1883 and 1884, Buttery cleaned and restored 33 paintings, 9 of them being the Reynolds in the library. The remaining paintings were on the ground floor in the saloon, the red room, the blue room, and the billiard room. Unfortunately, there is no information as to the type of treatment, simply the word cleaned. Staying with restorers of the 19th century, Petworth recently provided us with an interesting conservation project, which is called the Petworth Beauties. And I don't have time to discuss the whole project, so I'd like to recommend the talk given at the Court Hall by Richard Ashbourne, who was curator, and Katya Balaya, the assistant paintings conservator at the National Trust, and also one by Jim Diamond, who undertook the conservation work. They can all be seen on YouTube. The link with the 19th century is that the paintings in the beauty room were reduced from full length to 3/4 length portraits as a result of the 3rd Earl of Eckremont's decision in the 1820s to introduce the 2 large Napoleonic battle scenes, which you see below the beauties. Now, in order to accommodate that change, he says, I will cut off their legs. I don't want to see their petticoats. It was known that the legs and petticoats had been cut off, but retained behind the stretchers, as you can see on the right-hand side. When the painting of the Duchess of Ormond was removed from the stretcher, an inscription was found on the back, and it read, if I'll read it for you, all paintings should be painted at backs. After restoration, all paintings should be painted at the backs. Eduardus Retentor, 1835. Now, Eduardus Retentor was Edward Holder, and I think he obviously had a sense of humor, as retentor in Latin means to preserve or retain, and this was a play of words on his surname Holder, and possibly a message for posterity that the legs had been preserved. But the mystery is that if the 3rd Earl had commenced changes to the beauty room in 1826, what happened to the paintings between then and 1835 when we have Holder inscribing the stretcher? Well, the archives show that Holder had been undertaking restoration for the 3rd Earl in 1833, but I've yet to find any information about any earlier work at Petworth. However, there is a letter in the archives dated 1820 from a London restorer called Shestwick, who I know nothing about. And in it, he mentions that there is one picture at Petworth, now in a state of ruin, which I suggest that you send to me or to Mr. Turner of Headham Street. He's the best restorer in that department, and he is now doing the Titian picture your lordship ordered to be cut. And I think this is the Titian that may have been the portrait. It's the young cardinal. And there's anecdotal information at Petworth of the painting being cut down in order to fit the location over the fireplace in the marble hall. So I wonder if he was reducing the size of the Titian, if he might also have been responsible for cutting the beauties and simply tacking them onto their stretchers. And then at a later date, the paintings were removed and lined by Holder, thus accounting for the inscription of 1835. There's no evidence for this, but it might explain the mystery. So I'm hoping when the time comes and we can restore, or the National Trust can restore the remaining beauties, there might be more clues on some of the stretchers. As mentioned previously, Henry Bolton had also undertaken work at Petworth. Between 1846 and 1847, he not only cleaned 36 paintings, but he also cataloged and drew sketches of the painting collection. And these are just copies of what is in the files. And they're absolutely charming with little sketches. And then he gives greater detail about the paintings. And I have yet to find any correspondence related to these drawings, which might explain why he did that task. As he included details about the sitter or the subject and the artist and gave a brief description, it might have been the basis for a catalog of the collection. Between October and December 1854, he restores 84 paintings. And again, he draws little sketches identifying the paintings, but not actually saying what treatment he undertook. Now, I would like to leave the 19th century and enter the 20th century, as it's a very interesting time at Petworth. And it's also the time when the National Trust was beginning to acquire country houses and formulate an approach for the care of its collections. Between April 21st and July 1939, there were at least 15 restoration campaigns in which paintings were treated either in situ or in studio. Now, the details related to these treatments are more informative, indicating whether it's surface cleaning, the removal of dirt, or varnish or overpaint removal, revarnishing, and in some cases liming. Although it's interesting that there weren't that many instances where paintings were actually lined. The word repairing appears frequently, and I'm not sure if that refers to the consolidation of flaking paint or tear mending. From April 1921 until 1925, Frederick Augustus Dyer and his son Lawrence are restoring paintings, and they're doing it mostly in situ. They note that they're there for 26 days. From 1926 and until 1939, William Haddison Holder, going back to the Holder family, undertakes the restoration work. And he is the great-grandson of Edward Holder, who was at Petworth in the 1830s. The Holder family, like the Butterys, is generation after generation were restorers, and there are at least 4 generations of Holders. And you may not be able to see this very clearly, but at least in his invoices, he says what he's doing: cleaning, repairing, removing a few spots, removing discolored varnishes. So we're getting a little bit more detail as we come into the 20th century. In 1931, the restorer Kenneth North undertook the restoration of at least 3 paintings at Petworth. There were 2 Turners and 1 by Lanier. The Turner on the left-hand side is Tyne Bay or Tyne Harbor in Devon, and the one on the right is the Peasant Family by Lanier. And this restoration would ultimately lead to Lord Leconfield refusing to allow any further restoration of pictures. North was one of the few restorers at that time who combined scientific examination with conservation. As recorded in his obituary, it said, he made himself master of the means of diagnosis, such as X-ray, ultraviolet, infrared, and microscopic examination. Partly, no doubt, because he was entrusted with the work on the royal collections, and partly from his dislike of the garbled references to his methods, which got into the more sensational press. North was something of a mystery man. On an occasion when he admitted the press into his laboratory, North assumed an air of secrecy and portentousness, though he was always ready to explain things to anyone who showed a technical as distinct from a purely news interest in his work. Fortunately, there are reports on the condition and treatment of the Teignmouth Harbor by Turner, and John Brealey's subsequent examination report of 1958 documents North's rather drastic approach to restoration. Turner had sometimes pressed sand and powdered glass into the wet paint. This had the effect of scattering light, which gave the painting a misty appearance, but it was also created a terribly vulnerable surface. Unfortunately, North's restoration method was rather extreme. It involved the removal of the sand and replacing it with fresh sand. I don't want to dwell on some of his other treatments at Petworth, but they did result in Lord Leconfield simply refusing to have any other conservation work undertaken for the next 25 years. And this is Lord Leconfield in all his glory. In 1947, Petworth House and its park were given to the National Trust, but not the collection or the estate. When Lord Leconfield died in 1952, his nephew, who inherited Petworth, was faced with large death duties, on the remaining contents and the estate. And his solution was to offer some of the paintings, of which there were about 700, and the contents to the treasury in lieu of the death duties. Although the precedent for transferring an entire house, contents, and estate had been established in the 1930s, this enabled the trust to take on many of the collections or houses and collections we have today. This was the first time that such a transaction involving the transfer of the contents separately had been considered by the Treasury. Oops. It is at this point that I'd like to introduce the characters involved in the negotiations and the conservation of the collection, which was necessary for the paintings to be accepted by the Treasury and then come into the ownership of the National Trust. We have to remember at that time that the trust was managed by a relatively small group of dedicated staff who were primarily concerned with the maintenance and running of the houses and the estates. And while they had knowledge of architecture and land management, there was no one who had a comprehensive knowledge of the paintings. Anthony Blunt, who you see on the left-hand side, was the surveyor of the Queen's pictures and was the trust's honorary advisor on paintings. He was asked by Robin Fedden, who was then secretary to the National Trust, to visit Petworth to see if anything needed to be done about cleaning and the rehanging of paintings, particularly as the house was completely unheated during the war, and the paintings had not been touched for 25 years. He worked with Bobby Gore, who we see on the right-hand side, and Bobby Gore was part of the trust, and the two of them worked together on organizing the picture restoration. How did Bobby Gore become interested in paintings? It's one of those wonderful stories of coincidences. During the Second World War, he was serving in Italy, and he was wounded, sent to recuperate in an Italian hospital. In the bed next to him was Horace Buttery, who had also been wounded. And during their recuperation, Horace talked about art, and he gave Bobby a book on Italian paintings. And after Bobby recovered, he remained in Italy with his regiment, and whenever possible, he would go into Italian churches and look at the paintings. And Bobby and Horace were to meet again at Petworth when Bobby takes an active role in working with Blunt on the organization of the conservation of paintings. And he would eventually replace Anthony Blunt and become the Trust's first full-time curator for paintings. Initially, Blunt engaged Sebastian Issip to undertake the conservation of paintings. Issip, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, had been born in Vienna. He became a restorer in the 1920s, but he fled to England in September of 1938. He was a well-respected picture conservator, having worked for the National Gallery, the Tate, the Victoria and Albert, and the Royal Collection, where he would have met Blunt. Now, sadly, he died in 1954, so his work at Petworth was limited. Blunt also admired Horace Buttery, and he arranged for Buttery to restore the paintings by Van Dyck and Reynolds, as well as many others. When Horace died in 1962, Blunt wrote an obituary recording that Buttery did more than anyone of his generation to preserve things of beauty in this country. Now, Holder died in 1947, and his business was passed on to William Vallance and his son, Roy. And it was Roy who undertook a limited amount of restoration work at Petworth. From what I could so far gather from the archives, the work that was sent to Vallance tended to be the work that the other restorers simply didn't have time to do. Blunt soon realized that a considerable amount of restoration work would need to be undertaken on site. And at this point, John Brealey enters the picture. And this is a photograph of John Brealey when he's at the Metropolitan in London. Because after he finishes his career in London, he goes to the Metropolitan, where he becomes the director of the conservation section. John Brealey had also served in the Second World War, and after the war, he sought advice from various people about paintings restoration, and one of them being Anthony Blunt, who was at that time director of the Court Hall. Blunt suggested that he apprentice himself to Johannes Hell, a respected private restorer who was also working in London, having fled Europe during the war. Brealey was to spend 3 years with Hell and also a year at the Court Hall, learning the scientific side of conservation. John was only 26 years old when Blunt approached him to undertake the in situ work at Petworth, and he was to spend months at Petworth working on 50 paintings. And Blunt records that Brealey and I were alone in the house, and in the evenings we sat in the White Library, the only room with a fire. This was no doubt a great comfort, as there was no heat in the house at that time. However, Brealey records that it was marvelous working in the Marble Hall, which was his studio, with the deer coming up to the window in the early morning. Brealey soon became Blunt's preferred conservator and undertook studio work on many of the paintings, as well as continuing to visit Petworth for the in situ work. The monumental effort to conserve the paintings in preparation for the opening of Petworth to the public was a turning point for the Trust. Many country house owners and restorers employed by them ensured the preservation of paintings, whether in a systematic approach to their care or one guided by events in the life of the owners. But that transfer of the responsibility to the Trust has ensured a systematic and sustainable approach, which led to the establishment of the conservation section devoted to the care of paintings and other contents. In my talk, I have focused on 2 properties, Saltrum and Petworth, but I'm beginning to collect information on other National Trust properties, Addingham, Up Park, Nostell Priory, Upton. And I find this all very interesting, and I'm hoping that with the lifting of restrictions, I'll be able to have more access to the archives in these properties. I do want to thank Jacob Simon, as his database has been an incredible resource tool in my efforts to try and record the restorers who worked for the National Trust. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, that's a very interesting talk. Do we have, no, we have no questions at the moment. Come along, ask some questions. I have a question. When you looked at in the early years of the various campaigns to restore, were you aware of how long between one campaign and another?
Well, it's interesting. Certainly at Saltrum, there seems to be about a 25-year gap there. And one of the things that my predecessor, Sarah Staniforth, had done, looking at some of the detailed records at Kettleston, was trying to estimate the time period between what we call in situ visits and what would be required for full restoration. And we felt that the records were showing that it was about 25 years where there would be an in situ visit, and 100 years between major restoration work, which would involve lining. And I think, you know, when we're talking about those visits, you have to remember that there would have been open fires in the houses. So a certain amount of dust and smoke would have accumulated on the paintings. So I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that we would be seeing in those properties where there was a concern for restoration, a repetition of visits by restorers.
Oh, that's really interesting, because some years ago, and I've forgotten, you know, I don't have all the details in my head, but I reviewed the extant documentation for historic royal palaces on the Rubenses, the banqueting hall. And I found that, you know, they were basically, you know, canvas paintings, but held horizontally. So sagging, gravity was a factor. and I found they were lined every 50 years.
Mhm.
And then thinking changed, I would say. And then I think there was well over 160 years in which they were not lined, and they began to look like Chesterfield sofas. So they were put on hardboard, not on hardboard, on plywood,
Yeah.
by a firm of decorators.
Mhm.
Yes.
Which is not unusual.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
I mean,
But it's interesting that everybody you've talked about seems to have specialized in, they may have been artists, but they also restored.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I mean, I still have a lot of work to do, but I have been surprised from the records I found so far, that there aren't that many cases for lining. And it's really coming into the late 19th, early, 20th century that I think we find more and more lining occurring. Now, maybe that's because some country house owners simply neglected their collections. I'm not sure, or whether it's because there was more interest in lining to extend the life of the paintings.
Well, it's my experience that people don't realize that things out of sight are rotting.
Mm.
Yes. We have some questions from Joanna. A book called Chemistry of Cleaning Pictures was referred to. What was the name of the author again?
Well, he was called, on the receipt, it says William Buchanan, but I haven't been able to find a copy of that. And I think I even looked at the British, going through the British Library. So I'm not sure if it exists, but I still keep looking.
Okay. When do you think covers for paintings ceased as an accepted and normal activity?
I can only talk from experience of working in the trust, in that when I first joined the trust in 1990, the houses were put to bed, which is a very typical country house procedure. And at that time, all the contents except paintings were covered. And one of the reasons being, the sheer difficulty of doing that. When you consider that in country houses, they would have a very large staff. And in the National Trust, of course, we have wonderful staff at the properties, but it would have been a big undertaking. And so paintings in general weren't covered during the winter months. And now the trust is open almost year round. So again, there's simply no effort to cover any pictures. Well, I shouldn't say that. Sometimes some of the properties do cover their paintings.
I did wonder if it might have something to do with dust on the frames. Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, this is jumping about. Just a second. Okay. Beside the cleaning recipe with ashes by Catherine Wyndham, did you find more cleaning instructions or descriptions of these, including materials used?
There are lots of recipes for cleaning pictures, but I have to say my favorite one is the fresh urine from a red-headed boy. I often
okay.
I thought at the trust it'd be a great, we were always asked to interact with the public, and I thought it'd be wonderful if we'd get some red-headed boys to pee in a bucket and then try it out. But there are numerous recipes from. I think friction was the other, certainly in the select committee accounts. There was either solvents, spirits of wine, or friction, and they would be talking about whether it would be friction from your hand or using something else in between to try and remove a very old and brittle varnish.
Oh, so seriously brittle, so that it was just breaking up.
It would just break up.
Yeah. Yes, because I have come across the idea of, rubbing dry, powdered Dama resin on a painting, and that breaks down the rest of it through friction. Yes, I haven't tried it. Yes. Oh no, hang on a second. Have any supplies, tools, etc. survived in the National Trust's archives that you know of?
Not that I know of. I'm afraid I haven't found any, but now that I'm retired, I can spend more time looking for this type of thing.
Great talk. Somebody who's anonymous. Obviously, the Petworth Beauties, I'm assuming, where they cut the paintings down, is there evidence the frames were also cut to fit, or can you see from archives that new frames were bought or made?
Because they would have had larger frames when they were full length, and they would have been displayed between, the description is they were displayed between thin mirrors. And I believe, and I don't know if Katja's on the in the webinar, but the frames, when they were cut down, the frames were not modified. The paintings were inset into new paneling, and then molding was put around the frames, around the paintings. So as far as I know, there aren't the original frames for the paintings.
Okay. Do you know if Turner used sand in any of his other paintings? That's a question for Joyce, who
I was going to say,
doesn't
Joyce
see.
is,
Yes, Joyce, you're not here.
Yeah, I would have to say that would be something that Joyce could answer much more effectively than I could. And to be honest, this was sort of the first time when I came across this discussion about the sand. I think what happened from what North writes in his report, he says that the sand is so embedded in the layers and layers of dark varnish that the only way to get the varnish off is to take the sand with it. So that's why he removes the sand, and then he tries to add new sand, and then he tries to create the effect of that. I know. And he tries to create the effect of the sort of more misty or matte appearance by waxing the whole painting. I mean Kenneth North was an interesting character, because we also have reference to the Linaire, which I showed you. He talks about to protect the back, putting a coating of bakelite and aluminium on the canvas. I can only assume that it must be a bakelite resin that he would have coated one side of the canvas and then perhaps coated the other side with an aluminium paint. But there are a few paintings in the trust which were done by Kenneth North, and they are quite heavy now, thanks to that.
Oh. Did you find these instructions on books or in personal notes / archives?
I think most of them would come from those books of Merritt, Mogford, and Holyoake. The other ones that came from Catherine Wyndham, that would have been in her own account book. Where she got that recipe from, I'm not sure. So
it is, it is quite an apocryphal one, as it were.
Yes.
What solvents were used in the 19th century to remove varnish coats?
Well, I think the most common one was spirit of wine. So I think it was an alcohol. I'm trying to think if there's any other ones that, they
gin?
Didn't come across gin necessarily, but they were using different materials to try and slow down the effect of the alcohol. I think it was Copaiba balsam, and what was the other one? I'd have to look at Henry's list. Sorry, I didn't answer that very well.
How widespread do you think the practice of cleaning with ashes and coating with whipped eggs were? If I've got that right, is any evidence found of these practices during the present day conservation?
I think it probably was more widespread than we realize. And once it was on, because paintings were, were repeatedly being revarnished and not necessarily surface cleaned. I know there were some paintings, I think it was at Castle Ward, I think, where there was this, when the paintings were cleaned, there was this really tough gray layer. And, we thought that might have been the remains of an egg white varnish that had been applied to it. And I think, and I hope this is where other conservators will be able to add to this, but I think it probably is becoming more recognized as something that was done and not necessarily removed. Oftentimes it was put on with the intention it would be removed at a later date, but I don't think that always happened.
Hang on, there's a note in the chat from Joanna saying her PhD in historical cleaning methods between 1600 and 1900. I found significant references to the use of ashes. Just a second, if I can just find Joanna. I can't find you, and sort of let her talk. Here we go. Okay, Joanna. It's also,
Hi.
I don't know where I get this idea from, but I also have this idea in my head that egg white varnishes were quite a common practice on the Academy varnishing day. They drying quicker. Utter silence.
Sorry, is that the question for me?
No, it's just a statement, and if you can confirm or tell me I'm talking rubbish.
I'm focused on cleaning methods, so I'm actually leaving the varnish outside because I already have so many things to deal with.
Okay.
But I found that the spirit of wine is one of the, I think it's one of the reagents that is called the, it's very commonly used. But they also make reference to the essential oils, ether, naphtha, acetone, benzene, between others, and turpentine, of course.
I think, didn't Claire Hurd, I think she did either a dissertation or a paper when she was at the Hamilton Car on the cleaning
papers,
used by restorers in the 18th and 19th century. So I think, and sadly, because I couldn't get access to the Hamilton Car thanks to COVID, I wasn't able to really go to look at that. But I think.
And Marcia Stolz-Whitlocks also has a paper published at Icon CC on cleaning methods. She's actually my co-supervisor.
Sorry, what was her name?
Marcia Stolz-Whitlocks from University of Amsterdam.
Okay.
She has a paper on cleaning methods from 1600 to 1900 published at ICOM, I think 2013.
Thank you.
That remains for me to say thank you very much, Tina. Keep up the good work. We'll invite you back.
Well, thank you very much.
Spatulas I have known.
Yes.